Okay, can you hear me talking now?
I believe so, yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, that's, yeah, I'm not planning. Let's go back.
All right, we're going to go ahead and get started.
Yeah, I'm on mute. I'm on mute.
All right, so next up is Scott. He's going to talk about some ransomware. If you guys want to go ahead and take a seat. I hear feedback. Did your microphone wasn't on?
Lost my screen. Go back. It's showing me as... No, it's off. No. Well, it's because they had the mic or the speaker on over there. If they turn that speaker off.
Oh, that's plugged in through you.
Oh, okay. So I have to use mine.
We switch to HDMI, you have to mute your speakers.
Let's turn it off.
I don't think Jeff's on page. Yeah, he's trying to use we're getting feedback.
The volume up. Okay, so I switched it back to my local speakers, and then I just turned the volume down because I couldn't control the speaker out there.
We got the speaker.
Yeah.
Everybody's bio is up on the website. If you haven't read it, be sure to check out the
Well, thanks for coming out. Again, my talk was going to be about ransomware. Yay, why it's not the actual problem. About me, I'm a principal research consultant at TrustedSec. I've been at TrustedSec for about 5 years. For about 4.5 of those years, I've worked in incident response. We've worked with many different companies, from very small to very large. During that time, I get to see a lot of different types of environments and different types of incidents. So kind of today's talk is going to be kind of about what I've seen during these incidents and what I've experienced. For me, my background is software dev. I kind of got into IR because I like tearing apart malware. I like writing malware. Kind of like earlier conversation, there was talking about CTF is a great way to learn. That's how I learned most of the things I deal with now. Today's agenda, again, ransomware. Everyone sees it. It's probably one of the most talked about topics in the news when it comes to cyber. It's one of the top 2 items that we get the most calls for as far as incidents. The other one being business email compromises. Funny thing about business email compromises, you tend not to see them as much in the news as you do ransomware. Again, kind of like I stated earlier, most of this presentation is based off of my experiences working through IR cases. So during my 5 years of working in or my 4.5 years working in incident response, I kind of got to see a little bit of an evolution inside the ransomware attacks themselves. When the ransomware attacks started, they were generally like a single computer that got infected or got compromised, got ransomware on it. And the ransoms were generally down to like $50 to maybe a couple $100. But they were really low, they were small value. The encryption software themselves weren't generally actually encryption, they were more obfuscation. So it was easy to actually just find something else online to get your data back. And they were kind of like low end. they started growing and started getting a little bit more advanced when people started figuring out how to protect themselves from it. Kind of the same cat and mouse game that you always get with the security. So they started moving into like encrypting more and more of the systems. And then as that starts growing, people started using backups more. So the backup systems, they stop paying the ransoms because now you have the backups. So the attackers get into your system. They start trying to figure out what kind of backup environments do you have? What tools do you use to protect your systems? So then they start attacking the backups. Initially, it was just shadow copies. Then they start building into the ransomware itself to disable shadow copies or overwrite them. Then they started moving the systems or the backups off system into like a central location. Now the attackers started getting access to your system, starting to monitor first. Find, okay, you're backing up into this environment. How can they disrupt it or corrupt it? So again, back and forth, that constant cat and mouse game. Some of the other things that we started seeing around that same time also, and this happened for a very short period of time, because the attackers weren't getting paid, because people actually had backups, we actually had a few calls with clients where the attackers had called in bomb threats. If you don't pay our ransom, we're going to bomb you. So they had ended up evacuating buildings. We heard about that for like 2, maybe 3 months with a few different clients. Something else that started happening is basically the attackers or organizations started discovering that there's money in this. So instead of being like 1 or 2 people doing it, it started becoming more of an industry for them. So you have large groups of people that will actually dedicate time and resources to developing the tools, getting in your systems. So it started to really grow, and about that same time, the cost of the ransomware started to spike. It just escalated really, really fast with what people were asking. Some of the initial big hacks where they started asking for millions of dollars for some of the bigger systems. Something else that is actually just kind of interesting, ransomware groups have some of the best customer service out there. They're better than Delta because they want your money. I've actually had a few clients who had to pay the ransoms, and they were actually really impressed with the quality of the customer service that they got. The other thing with it, also, it's spawned off lots of other side services, side companies, side businesses. I guess you can't go anywhere now without hearing about ransomware protection services. I was listening to Darknet Diaries the other day, and I think 2 of the commercials on there were for ransomware protection services. Also, there's now ransomware negotiators. So if you get hit with ransomware, you can call this negotiator who will do the negotiations for you, and surprisingly, they work. We've not recommended any, but we've worked with clients who've used them, and they've almost got the asking price down to almost like 1/10 sometimes of what they initially ask. Something else that's interesting, again, with it being a larger business, they're constantly trying to find ways now to get more money. So yes, you got hit with ransomware. That's maybe not their primary thing. They've got into your system already. They know your environment. They've already exfilled your sensitive data. Now they'll come back a month or 2 later and say, well, if you don't want us to release this, pay us more money. And that's always a fun topic to come up with clients, is the fact of, do you trust them? They're crooks. They stole your data. If you go out and pay them X amount of money to protect your data, it doesn't stop them from actually releasing it. Other ones will release on auction sites. There's a couple different types of auction sites. We'll only sell this data once. So they try to drive the price up to only sell 1 copy. And then the clients will have the potential to buy their own data back. Or they'll open up for everyone to get. And that's generally a lower price, but they try to sell more copies. Recently, well, somewhat recently, ransomware now is becoming more of a service, where you can go into purchase a platform. They'll provide you with the ransomware. That software is a little different than some of the other ones I'll talk about, because those generally include a little bit more of like an implant rather than just the ransomware software. Something else that we've also seen a few times, actually quite a few times, doing the IR cases, we'll track back to where it was initially the initial infection. We'll see the attackers come in real silently, do a little bit of reconnaissance around the environment, try to figure out what the protections are, did they get caught, but not do anything. They're really, really under the radar. And then they'll come back in maybe a week or every month just to check to see if they still have access. And then all of a sudden somebody will come in and it's like a bull in a china shop. They'll make so much noise, throw out all their tooling, and then that's when they release the ransomware. One of the things that we've been noticing is that tends to be somebody will get the initial access and then sell off that access to other people. We've had one case where they sold it off to like 3 different attackers. We've seen people, it was kind of interesting because it was really confusing during the IR case. It was like the methodology seemed all over the place until we realized it was a couple different groups that were using the same access point. One of them was trying to exfil data and then trying to do more like corporate espionage. And then the last group came in and just released ransomware and basically screwed over the 2 people that were already in there trying to be under the radar. So just a curiosity, how many, you guys don't have to raise your hands or anything, but how many people have worked with ransomware or been affected by ransomware? A couple. Lucky. It's ugly. So kind of getting into ransomware itself. So the evolution that I talked about was of a ransomware attack. To be considered ransomware attack, they basically all they had to do was at some point release ransomware. So the ransomware itself, so actually I grabbed the image off online. It irritates me because it's actually backwards. Sorry, I didn't notice it until I put it in the slide. But ransomware, the whole goal is to try to find your files and encrypt them in a way that you need to pay them to get your regular data back. Kind of talked early on, ransomware was more obfuscation, where they either would go in and XOR it, or they'd use some type of one-time pad to XOR. It was weird. They would do ROT13 sometimes. It was just enough to obfuscate it so the general person had no idea what it was. They started moving that over then to actual encryption. The encryption basically will just make it look like garbage. To kind of pivot off the earlier topic, the magic values, I don't know if you can see up there, like on the right-hand side, the GIF tells you it's a picture. Where on the left, you have no idea what it is. So I'll get into this a little bit more later on, but generally, ransomware is stupid. It's very simple code. Most people could probably write in a couple hours to get a generic ransom, something that would go out and encrypt. Some of the more advanced pieces take a little longer, but in general, they don't spend a lot of time on the ransomware software itself. How does it get in? Well, I'm calling it drive-by. This is your typical, you post it up on some like forum, somebody downloads it, some website that somebody browses to and it infects your computer. And this is not the ransomware. This is just how the attackers get in. This is your normal, how you got phish type of thing. I'm calling opportunistic. Opportunistic generally comes up with a 0 days released, a proof of concepts pushed out, like the hafnium type things, where somebody gets hold of it and they go out searching for people who have it. Similar to like spray and praise is what I'm calling them, where they just send out a bunch of things to a lot of people in hopes that something hits. What a lot of people are worried about are more the targeting attacks, where your organization is specifically picked out and attacked by a group. Kind of talked about earlier, supply chain. This one we've seen a lot more recently, and it's not the traditional supply chain. You might have an IT vendor that does your IT management, or you have a third-party security firm that does your monitoring. They have access into your system. They get compromised, and then all of their clients are then compromised because they have your data. They have your admin access. And then we talked about ransomware as a service. Who's targeted? Well, pretty much anyone. What you see about in the news a lot of times are those big companies that get hit with ransomware. But from what we've seen, a lot of the small companies that you might not ever heard of are the ones that actually are the most money. We've had a bunch of different, we had some like third-party or some nonprofit types that were raising millions of dollars get compromised and hit with ransomware. The size of the business doesn't necessarily mean or correlate to how much that client has or how much the ransomware people are asking for it. Different types of IT stacks. So again, it goes back to like a 0 day or something that gets released. And if you have an unpatched system, it gives people will go out there and use like Shodan to search the internet to try to find, okay, this group has happened to be open to this vulnerability. We can get in. Client-vendor relationships is another one that we've seen, where a client A gets compromised. They use the existing communications back and forth between client A and client B to then trick them into installing some software or browsing to a site and infecting them. So another thing that we see all the time in the news is groups and attribution. These irritate me personally as an IR person because almost always one of the first questions we get is, who did it? And it's like, because during a normal kickoff call, we'll be trying to figure out what the client wants. What is their end goal? And almost always it's, who did it? And that's generally not important, at least at the beginning. The importance is, how did they get in? What did they do while they're in? And honestly, a lot of these are rotating groups. The people who you hear inside these different ransomware groups, sometimes they rotate between each other, they share code. Sometimes they try to make attacks look like each other. One thing you'll notice when you start looking through the codes, there's snippets of codes taken from other people. So it's not really useful as much as far as who did it. The nice thing about if you can identify the who did it, sometimes you can find some of their TTPs and use that in your analysis to try to find what else they did in your system. But a lot of times, it's extra help. Again, like the code variants we talked about, it's easy to write. It's easy to steal from other people. I'll get a little bit later on into the complexity of the code. Sorry?
The TBA, variant part.
I couldn't think of anything that had variant in it other than that, so. So again, back to the main thing. Why is ransomware the scapegoat for a bigger issue? Again, the bigger issue is your environment is already compromised. Originally, or sometimes you might get a one-off ransomware that they release it and it compromises the system. But generally anymore, most of what we see is the attackers get into your environment through like a phishing or through a browse. Normally it's through like a phishing. They get their foothold in. They use that to reconnaissance the rest of the environment to see what you're running, what's your detections looking like. Have they been caught? They will then sometimes take their time, other times they rush through things. But the normal goal then is to move laterally and escalate privileges. They try to get domain admin as fast as possible. And from there, a lot of times they'll use your existing like patch network or software deployment systems to push the ransomware out. Other times they'll use their own scripts to map the network, to try to identify what's their targets. A lot of times they also will spend their time to see what in your system is the most valuable. So they won't just go out and encrypt every one of your systems. They'll try to make sure that they encrypt the systems that will hurt you the most, that makes you want to actually pay the ransom. Again, I talked about a little bit earlier about how sometimes one group will come in, get the initial access, and then sell it off to a different group later on. So, again, I talked about, again, some of the things that they're really interested in is what in your system is particularly vulnerable or accessible. Some of the things that they will do, they'll encrypt those or they'll take them out. We talked about they'll use those for extortion later on. And one thing that we see a lot is that ransomware is not really the main purpose of the attack. The ransomware is a great anti-forensics tool. It goes through and encrypts your logs files. It goes through and a lot of them will remove like your shadow copies. They encrypt a bunch of your event logs. Something we'll see later on when I go through one of the examples is that something that the ransomware will also try to do is some of them will clear out your event logs. Very first part of their run, they'll clear them out, they'll execute themselves, and try to encrypt everything, and the last step, it'll try to clear your event logs again. So kind of like I talked about, the complexity of ransomware code itself, it really varies. It's code. But if you really want to think about the attack chain or the process that they're going through, most of the advanced attackers have access to your system. So by the point that they actually go to run this, the ransomware on your computers or on your systems, they already know your systems. They know your protections. So they have them disabled. So the ransomware software itself they focus more on how can they make that run faster, more efficient, rather than trying to build in all the tools to bypass AV or EDR detections. They don't really most of the time care about escalating privileges. They don't care about mapping your network a lot of times. The mapping that they'll try of your network to see, okay, what map drives do you have? Some of them will go out and try to see if there's shares on your network. But that's the extent they do. A lot of them don't try to like worm where they try to pivot their vulnerability. You can, again, it's software. You can make it pretty much do whatever you want. But a lot of them, they want to spend those times and the complexities of obfuscating their code. A lot of times the ransomware itself, they don't spend that much time on it because they don't care. They already have your system. There could be signatures. They disabled your EDR. No point in hiding at that point. So I completely stole this image from a ransomware vendor site. It kind of goes over what's the differences between malware and ransomware. On the ransomware side, I don't particularly like the last three because I've not seen too many of them try to elevate privileges. You might be admin, they might try to elevate themselves to system. Because when you actually go in, you have a lower context. If you're just admin, you have to bump it up to get access to a little bit more. I don't consider that quite elevation of privileges. I think if you go in as a regular user or some type of service account, escalating yourself to admin, in my opinion, is escalation of privileges. Transferring files and data. I don't see a lot of ransomware actually doing this. Most ransomware that I see don't like to beacon out. It's a lot of times it just wants to run and encrypt things local. Almost all the exfil they've done previously. That could be through other malware software, or it could be just they have. Unfortunately, a lot of times we see an RDP session where they just copy it out. And again, the exfiltration of key material, again, that is done normally outside of the actual ransomware software.
You're saying they like to transfer the data and all that stuff before they encrypt?
Yep.
So that's not part of the ransomware. That's part of the other, that's for the active engagement.
Yeah, and that's the reason I like to call a distinction between a ransomware attack and the ransomware itself. Normally when you hear people talk about ransomware, they think that it's just one executable, one program that does it all. When a lot of times it's not, the ransomware itself is just a very small part. General malware itself, there's the wonderful tons of different things that the malware will try to do, and hiding itself, gaining persistence. The obfuscation in malware itself is sometimes just a nightmare if you try to reverse it. A lot of malware itself, they'll key to the actual systems or the domains you're using. None of that is seen inside ransomware, which is part of the reason why it's so hard for like your AVs or EDRs to detect the ransomware, because it's using basic things. It will run like your WinZip, like if you try to password protect a file or a group of files. It runs using basic, I open files, I write files, I delete files. The encrypting of the files, they normally will use the same file. They'll open it, encrypt all the data, and then write it back. So, kind of blew through that really fast because I wanted to spend a little bit more time going through samples, which I'm hoping you guys can be able to see. So I'm going to go through the Conti sample of ransomware to demonstrate the complexity of it. One thing I happen to also do is I have the source code for it, so it's easier to read for anybody who likes C. I don't know how many people here like C, so C is a little easier to read than assembly. But I also have a Ghidra version of the assembly for a similar Conti sample. So I can kind of show you what it looks like when it's in C and what it looks like when it's been compiled.
How did you get the code?
Somebody posted a link inside a work chat, and I just downloaded it. I think if you also go to like what's it, VX Underground? They have, that's where I got the sample, but I think they also have the code up there as well. They do have code for a couple others, different ransomware and malware samples too that have been leaked. They also will have write-ups on people who've done research or analysis of them. So it's kind of a nice if you don't have time, especially during an IR case when you get a piece of malware and you don't have time to actually dig into it to figure out what it does. Going up to some of those sites will give you a cheat sheet into what to look for. They might not match 100%, but it gives you a good idea. I've had a situation in the past where a client was hit with some malware, and they had an audited coming in like the next day, or no, on the next week, and I had a weekend to reverse engineer the malware. I happened to go out and find almost the exact same code base. So I was able to go side by side and actually figure it out in like a day or two, rather than like sometimes reversing takes weeks to months. So let's exit that. Oh, let me see. That way I can see it too. Otherwise it's really hard.
How many live roles?
So, So this is, I'm not going to go through every one of the files. Can you guys see this at all? Yeah, I didn't think about this two-way through when I was setting it up, but it's like, So there's only going to be a handful of these files that I'm actually going to walk you guys through. A lot of the other ones are just helper or supporting files. Let's start off with just the main. So the initial pieces of what they come in is they do this initialize API module. This one will actually then go through and try to register your libraries that it'll need so that it doesn't link them directly. This is kind of, it makes a little more obfuscation when you're looking at the code as well. So, and I apologize guys, I use Vim. So if you see me bouncing around, that's what I'm doing. So this one will go in first, and because to get the API address, it will look for the libraries, for the hashes. It will try to load the basic libraries. Not a whole lot to it. It will allocate a space that it will use then as a reference for later on. The next is the disable hooks, where it will go through and any hooks that are already set up for like your kernel 32, your Win32 drivers, NTDLL, any of the type of libraries they're going to be using. It will grab hold of those and then try to reload its own copy of them. Later on, it will go then through and just try and clean up the hooks so that anything that's using is using its copy, its pointer of them, rather than the normal ones that are loaded in. it goes through and generates a list, or it takes basically a bunch of queues of, okay, how many drives there are shared drives, what are the hosts around it, are there any whitelisted PIDs? Something that Conti will do is it will go through and try to kill off previous versions. Or if you give it an ID or a name of something, a process, it will try to kill those beforehand. It creates a mutex. Again, it's trying to protect itself to see if it's already running, so it doesn't run multiple copies of itself and ends up fighting. This copy has debug. So if not debug, then it parses the command line for your inputs coming in. If it's debug, it writes its own, just a test one. Next steps that it does, it grabs your system's information. This is used to try to determine how beefy is your system. How many threads can it spawn to start your encryption? So that's what these two lines are doing, is trying to determine, okay, how many threads can I use for local? How many threads will I use for network? Then next thing it does, it creates a thread pool. Basically, it's going to be, let me move into, I had these set up online so I could see them all on the page, but they don't show up here. So create thread pool actually just comes in, it sets up the events that it's using so that anytime you put a new file name on the queue, the thread itself that's running in the background will pop that name off and try to encrypt that file. And then you can have multiple threads running, all doing the same type of work. That part will actually be when we call the bottom part here. The start itself comes in, checks to see what type of thread pool you're saying, whether you're doing network local, backups. And then this for loop will take that value we said earlier of how many threads or how many processes we do, and it will actually create a thread that's running this thread handler. I'm really used to a very large monitor. Actually, my desk one's not too far off. One thing I found is like the reverse engineering with a very large monitor is very nice. Trying to do it on a laptop. I know. I had originally like four monitors and I hated it. So I found one that was a 42-inch actual monitor. And I replaced all of them with just it. And I wanted a widescreen, but I also would need the height. It's completely derailed. Sorry. Yeah. Wow, that was full when I got here.
I really want you to die in the middle of the presentation.
Thank you. I have had issues with this computer and its battery. This is the second battery I've used in it. I don't run much on this. Honestly, anytime I have a server at my house that I run Proxmox on, that I do all my analysis on. And this is just basically a dumb computer. Okay, so once it comes into this thread, it sets up a couple different things at the first part of it, and then it gets into your while loop that basically just, pulls things off of that queue. And then it will try to, it does some interesting things where it tries to sorry, let me double check, make sure I'm not getting ahead of myself. Okay, yeah, so this one comes through, it grabs out the name off the queue, it does a couple things looking at the name to try to determine, okay, have we already encrypted this or not? And then it will eventually come down and follow into this encrypt function inside Locker. Inside this is where, okay, it goes through the actual encryption steps of it. The one thing I think that's interesting with this is it tries to determine what kind of file it is. Is it a database file? Then they make sure they encrypt all of the file. If it's a VirtualBox or a VM, they'll only encrypt part of the file. Part of the thinking behind that, I think, is the fact that those files are so large that if they spend all their time just running over a 100 gig file, if you detect it, there's a better chance you can stop them from getting to other files that are more sensitive. So they're only going to encrypt certain parts of that file just to corrupt it, and then move on to others. They overwrite it. So the issue is if you try to copy a file, there's a chance it's still on the disk and you can recover it. It just removes the pointer to the inside the NTFS. But if you do some more deep forensics on it, there's an off chance that you might be able to recover parts of it. Yeah. Yeah. So the other side of the thing that this piece of malware will actually do is it'll check the file size itself. If it's a very, very large file, it will only encrypt a part of it. If it's underneath a certain file size, then it will encrypt all of it. I'm not going to actually dig into the actual what they're doing for the encryption. Most of this you can really just go on to Stack Overflow and copy out the encryption software. That's pretty much what they use a lot of times. Sometimes they'll go in and they'll get third-party libraries they'll pull in.
Does it have like a barometer so you don't notice it while it's working?
So
I know you said it does the threads, but I mean, does it actually?
this one I did not see. Actually, that was going to get into something I was going to talk about later. There's a lot of tools out there that are ransomware products that people are selling. They're like, yes, we're going to stop ransomware. Some of their detections is just the fact that touching files so fast. That's what it triggers on. So yeah, having something that will go through and say, okay, I'm only going to encrypt 10 files at a time or in a minute, or some rate limiting will bypass any of that type of protection. But again, it's software. It's not that hard to actually put some type of rate limiting in here.
Is there any type of internal inventory management recording how many systems are being affected with it? And what, if it's attempting it and being successful or not?
Nope. A lot of times, again, the ransomware itself is dumb. They just throw it out and hope it works. Most of the time it will work because they're running it as an admin. As far as what we've seen inside IR cases itself, one of the first things they do with a reconnaissance is they develop a list of all your hosts, and that's what they use to kind of check off of whether or not they've ran it on there.
Is that what negotiators working off of, saying that because the software is dumb, they don't know how many systems they've actually affected?
Hopefully, well, yeah, the negotiators sometimes work independently of the IR investigation, but by the time that they get brought in, we have a pretty good idea of how many computers were affected. Because not all the time, no. And that kind of actually goes back to something I kind of meant to talk about earlier. With some of the different types of ransomware attacks, with the spray and praise or the drive-bys, the ransomware itself is not keyed right. So it's a generic private key. So it might 20 organizations might get hit with the same ransomware. One person pays, posts the decryption online. It's usable for the others. They moved to try and be more specific for each organization. That is another thing that's a little bit more of a headache for the ransomware groups, is the fact of how do they know which key goes to what software? Some of them, sometimes we did see them beacon out that data. Most of the time it's built into like the ransom note. Here's a key, give it to me. That we'll line that up with what version of the ransomware we gave you, so what key lines up to it. Sometimes when they're in the releasing ransomware, they'll use the same ransomware with different keys. So you'll buy a decryption tool. It will only work for part of your files because they'll come back, oh, sorry, yeah, that's a new tier of level service. So something else that I wanted to get into and kind of show in here real quick before kind of moving on. How are we doing time? Oh, sorry, I'm running late. Obfuscation, as far as when you get into malware. So one of the first things that I ever do when I'm running malware, I run file to see what is it really. It checks your magic headers. I run an MD5 hash of it, a SHA 256 hash, and then I run strings. You'd be shocked with how fast strings will give you the answers you need. With this one, I don't know if you can see as well, the OBFA, and there's an OBFW. Any idea what OBF stands for? Obfuscation. The A is your ASCII, the W will be like your wide string, your unit of code. So inside the code, these are all really readable strings. When you actually get into the reversing, and I don't know how to zoom this part in. Darn. This part down here is what that string looks like. So what the OBFA and OBFW is a pre-compiler option. So when you go to actually compile this, it removes the string and then puts this obfuscation routine in its place. So what they'll do is I relabeled these so I knew what they were. They'll put the characters in basically a byte array, and then they'll come down and do a simple math operation on it to get back to the original piece. And in this case, it's whatever the original value was, subtracted by some value, multiplied by another value, and then modulus so that it's back inside the a regular byte range. So this is just annoying when you're doing reverse engineering and this is what you're looking at, because the way they did this is that OBFW and OBFA uses a random value generator for the pre-compiler. So each one of these strings is compiled or obfuscated using the same technique but different values. So writing a script to go through is a little bit more of a pain. So to cheat, let's see if I can bring this up. Come on. This is not liking my tmux. Oh, darn. Well, looks like I'm not going to get to show you that, because I can't. There we go. So when I first started going through it, I always the way I tend to do things is I always have like a Python file that I write, and I was doing a new function for each one until I realized that there was a pattern to them, and then okay, what I do? I'm not used to this keyboard. I always have a regular keyboard next to me. So when I got to the point I started realizing what the pattern was, I created two functions for the two different variations of their obfuscation. And then after that, I started printing out each of their sequences to figure out what was going on. And then I just dump it all out to the screen. And then I take that values and I put it back inside Ghidra as the variable inside there so I know what's going on. So as you can see with some of these, something I wanted to call out, it goes through and tries to remove your shadow copies. It's something like I'm really not going to have time to go into, which I was hoping to. But then they also will have lists of like different files that they're focused on. They do checks for that. They do check to see whether or not it was already encrypted. It will grab the name of the README file itself that they're putting the ransomware note. That's also obfuscated. One difference between the code base that I had and the actual exe sample was the exe sample had the ransom note as far as a resource. So it pulls it out of the resource, then writes it to disk. This will also say different files or folders inside the Windows directory that they're interested in. Sorry, rushing through this last part. So I kind of wanted to go real fast into like the actual defense for ransomware. Rather than focusing solely on ransomware itself, I like to say do basically your defense in depth. You have the tools that are out there to protect ransomware could help you. Yes, there are ways to bypass them, but they could limit the actual effectiveness of the ransomware software if it happens to get to that point. But rather than spending lots of money on the ransomware defense, you almost need to spend as much time up front to remove the attacker's dwell time. The amount of time that they're in your environment, the faster you can detect them and kick them out, the less damage they can do. So that comes up to a lot of times of just monitoring tools, your stack itself, and then having people that are able to actually look at those logs, look at what your SIEM's ingesting, and know what they need to focus on. We've seen a lot of times where like smaller companies will do third parties to do their SIEMs. And we get called in, and one of the questions they ask us is, why didn't our SIEM detect this? They had the logs. The person who looked at it just didn't know what they were looking at. So some of the things that we also say is do tabletops. It's basically a role-playing game. It's a safe environment where if you get a right company that comes in, they'll understand what your environment is like, customize the tabletop to be targeted against you, using things that they've seen in real life. And the idea is also to make it the worst possible day ever for you, because it's safe. Nothing's really going to be encrypted. But you can walk through your steps. If you have third-party vendors that do your IT and your security, you get them involved in it so you can see how they will answer the questions. If you have a third-party IR group, have them involved so that you know and you've gone through the stuff ahead of time. So you know how you're going to react, who to call, what they have, what they don't have. Again, I don't really recommend releasing ransomware in your environment to see how it will happen, but if you really want to live on the edge. But, okay, so I'm pretty much out of time. Questions?
What's the low and high of what you see pay out?
Again, when I first started in IR, we saw ransoms as like $150 to $200. We've seen them amass upwards of a couple million. It really depends on your environment, what you have. If they're confident that there's nothing you can do but go to them, the price is higher. We've worked with some clients who basically their whole company is going to go out of business if they don't pay the ransom. They had more problems negotiating than others who just wanted a couple documents back. Because the attackers have spent enough time in their environment to know the damage they caused. So that's how that set the price point.
Here's my question. It's not exactly technical question, but it relates practically. So over the last 2 years, operating environment for many companies changed a lot. It's became remote for many applications. So here is my question. In your personal opinion, and trust yourself, remote operation versus traditional on-premises operation, because perimeter changed in everything remote way, surface of attacks changed. So in your personal opinion, what do you see, what you have seen with this regard as far as ransomware?
So that's it. Yes, with everyone going remote, it has created an interesting dynamic for especially like ransomware, because what we've seen a lot of times now is a end user will get compromised at home. Some of the things that we've seen is they've got compromised through their personal accounts that pivoted then into their work computer that then waited for the VPN connection back to work to get in. And once they've done that, then they'll compromise a system inside, and then they'll use that to release the ransomware. They don't generally will do that from, okay.
Just keep talking.
Okay. They generally won't try to release the ransomware through the remote server, just because the network connection, the latency is just too long. They're not encrypting fast enough.
Yeah, thank you for my answer. It's a great answer, but I mean, as far as statistics, what you know, increase in successful ransomware attack with remote operation, or you don't have this statistics? That's what. To see what you personally trusted self knows.
So a lot of times when we're getting back to it, we don't get to that detail. We might find that it was initially, there was a come in the way I discussed, but we don't. A lot of the attacks are still, we can trace them back to internal, so we don't get as far as saying, okay, this came from a remote system, even though we do check that. Yeah.
For payment for ransomware, do they ever let people DoorDash use Chipotle?
I probably will get to that with a drop in Bitcoin.
Cloud environments make it easier or harder for ransomware?
Same, I want to say same difficulty, harder to infect more documents. Because normally the environment itself, you're going to get a single computer rather than a file share. So if they can get onto a vital system, but then a lot of times you'll have more backups with your providers. So you're able to say, okay, well, let's just go to last hour, last week, last month. We might lose some data, but we're not paying the ransom. Yes?
Good question for you. Have you guys ran into any issues when you're working with a client that's kind of hit that wall of we've got to pay because it's that bad? Have you ran into any issues where you're finding that it's that challenge of the U.S. government says, well, do not pay if the actors are part of XYZ nation state, but granted, we know attribution is very hard. 9 times out of 10, you're not going to know who it's attributed to before you get to that point, or even when you're at that point.
So our stance on it, we never tell a client to pay or not to pay. That comes a business decision on their part. We will walk them through, if they do decide to pay, steps they'll need to do to safely bring things back up. As far as you don't run the decryption software on your network. You might just reinfect yourself. You need to rebuild your environment in a lot of cases. As far as when we discuss with them and say, okay, is it US says you're not allowed to pay this country, we will tell them that. If we know, if we have that information, we will share it to them saying you're not supposed to do this. In the case of a company where they're going to go under unless they do it, a lot of times we don't tell us. Do what you need to do. It's not our call. Sometimes they'll do it. Most of the times if it's that dire, they'll do it. A lot of times we'll we'll suggest they get in contact with head drawing a blank, somebody to negotiate for them. Sure. And then they will come back going, yes, this group we cannot negotiate with. Okay. So, and then the other side note is we also bring legal in. If they have, almost as soon as we get on an incident, we say, involve your